Good afternoon, and certainly first and foremost, I also would like to give a sincere thank you to Mr. Akinci and your steel team, and Denise, who'll be coming in, for allowing me the moments today to speak about my favorite subject, steel in the United States. Matter of fact, my car at home in Houston, the license plate has STLONE, or Steel One. I actually tried to get steel, but somebody already had that. Again, my name is John Foster, and along with serving as the president of the Steel Trading and Trade Services Company, Kurt Orban Partners, and as the agenda says, I have the distinct honor of serving as the chairman of the American Institute for International Steel, or perhaps more easily said, the AIIS, or more easily yet, just the Institute. But my presentation today, as it was with Adicon, I'm going to start with more of a macro view of the market and start to drill down into a more micro aspect and highlight some of the really basic fundamentals of the market, talking about trade actions, a little bit about the fundamentals of some products, and also some specifications. I did not know the profile of the audience at the time, so again, some will be very basic, but not knowing who was in the steel market or not, I hope you'll find it interesting. And lastly, I'm going to be going into just some of the wants and needs of a typical steel buyer in the United States. And I want to thank a gentleman who helped me put this package together, a gentleman named Rich Brizzelli, who is also a colleague and friend on the board of the AIIS and works for Coutinho and Ferrostall. Now, he kindly helped me put it together and made it about a 30-minute presentation, which I'm going to have to slip into 20 minutes. So I might have to go through some of these slides a little more quickly than usual, but certainly we'll take the question and answer if there's any of these slides that kind of pique your interest. There we go. So first, I think for those not in the business day to day, this is a slide of the apparent consumption of steel mill products in the United States. It's done in quarters, this being 2009, and that was a recent history low at about 78 million metric tons. This is the first full year after the Great Recession, as we call it. And we just kind of clawed our way back to 2014, these 4 quarters here, where we hit a peak of an average, I should say, of 108 million metric tons, which is getting into the more traditional range going back over a 20 to 30-year period of the United States consumption being about 110 million tons. And that is considering a domestic production 20-year capability of about 90 million tons. So just doing some quick math, that 20 million ton on average over the long term is steel that has to come from outside the United States. So, of that consumption, what does the import penetration for steel look like? Going over the same 6-year period, we have, right after the Great Recession, the average during that year was about 25%. We started working our way back, as the prior slide showed, 23, 24%, until 2014, this period right in here, where it averaged almost 30%. Then it started to drop down again in 2015. And this also is very indicative of where we've been over the long 20 to 30-year history of imports accounting for between 20 and 25% on average. The question then might be, what is being imported in terms of steel products? And this is a slide of all countries, including Turkey. I think interesting to note here, the number one category or group, if you will, steel group, is hot rolled, cold rolled, galvanized, and hot rolled. That's the number one category for imported steels. Next comes pipe, line pipe, and OCTG. Between these two slides, OCTG took a precipitous drop, no surprise there, I think. Number 3 category group is the long products, rebar, wire rod, hot roll bar. I think, very important to the Turkish steel market. And I think as an example, just last year, out of 1.9 million tons of rebar that was imported into the United States, 1.4 million came from Turkey. That's a 77% market share in terms of imports. This is just another slide of 2 years of the slide we just saw, but the interesting thing here is the hot rolled and the hot dip galvanized, very consistent year on year, primarily because they tend not to be as involved in the energy market. This is more automotive, construction, consumer durable goods. OCTG took a 30% drop year on year, and that was on top of about 25% the year before, again, for the obvious reasons we know, in the energy sector. Interestingly, line pipe actually went up a little bit year on year. The dynamic there was that Korea tended to be pushing in a lot of their pipe before some of their final dumping duties came out, and line pipe projects, which had already been on the books for a couple of years and were already budgeted. Where do the steel imports go? And this goes back to one of my colleagues' slides earlier, and it's no secret why my friend and also AIIS board member John Mosley was here. Houston is double the next number of ports that are bringing in steel. Interestingly, the three top ones are all in the Gulf. This is a little easier picture to see. There's your Houston, New Orleans, Mobile. Laredo is a dry border port, as we call it. Everything coming out of Mexico. Detroit has some Great Lakes business, but most of it's coming into the automotive business out of Canada. The West Coast ports, which are also in the top 10, primarily semi-finished steels that are going into the re-rolling mills. You have Evraz, you have U.S. Steel POSCO here in the San Francisco area, and you have California Steel. None of them make steel, but they bring in slabs. This is a slide, I think, we're getting now into some of the economics of the steel business, and we're talking here at the quarterly net incomes of the steel industry as a whole, also going back to 2009. Not a particularly pretty picture when you look at some pretty serious loss years, and again, this is an average. It shows some of the, it includes, I should say, some of the, call them perennial winners, such as Nucor and Gerdau there in the United States, and also some of the perennial, let's call them challenge mills, such as U.S. Steel and AK Steel. So it's just not that hard to see why the mills do tend to get a little paranoid when they see market share, rightly or wrongly, going to what they perceive as a say, unfair import market, which those of us at the import side know better. Another dynamic that we keep hearing about is that manufacturing is growing, is coming back to the United States. People are reshoring, bringing plants back, some from China, some from Mexico, which is true, absolutely. But we also say here, not so fast. Because you see here, going back just a couple of years, this trend line is still positive, but the growth has slowed. And this is a drop of about 75%. The issues there, we are still experiencing a soft economy. There are still some consumer confidence issues, which we saw illustrated in how the stock market performed in the last year or so. It's finally reaching back to where it was about a year and a half ago. And as was mentioned earlier during some of the presentations, the United States business tax environment is the highest in the world. Now to get a little more customer focused, what do the steel customers in the United States expect from an import program? And as I mentioned or as Denise mentioned to me, she asked that I get into a little more specific as to what the customer's wants and needs are, and who has the biggest presence in the market, and what are some of the basics that really anybody who wants to expand their presence in the United States market has to look for. Now, I am a steel guy, but then again, every inquiry that we accept and solicit has these basic type of tenets to them. And again, this is very basic. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but what is the ASTM specification? What is the material? What is the shape? What is the grade? What is the class? The condition other than hot rolled? Is there heat treatment to it? This is important for us when we do business with our friends at AIIS for the normalized quenched and tempered types SBQ steels. Special packaging and coating. Damage is a perennial problem in importing, so export packaging, a very critical item, and color coding and marking, because more and more customers want to receive their steel by specific heat lots, not all mixed up, so they can keep them separate for their production operation, and having them properly color-coded or marked allows the segregation that's done at the receiving port to be done much more quickly, and time is money. Typical ordering specifications. Again, don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but you have the American Society for Testing and Materials, that's ASTM. That basically rules the roost when it comes into specifications that our customers have to meet for their customers. Now, these are easily obtained online for a cost, going to www.astm.org. But if you do want to expand your presence in the U.S. market, I would strongly suggest you get online and get the books or the library of books that you want in terms of participation. If you're going to do cold rolled steel, you better be familiar with ASTM 568. If you, rebar, who obviously Turkey is extremely familiar with that, ASTM 510, I'm sorry, 615, usually grade 60, not necessarily grade 40, and there's a grade called 706 where there's a seismic application involved. And wire rod, which is one of my favorite products, my license plate in California when I was doing wire rod was wire rod. It's ASTM 510. So is there an overall statement that one can say to exporters and importers? And we have heard many, many times from our customers, essentially that importers need to be better because of the perceived risks associated with working with importing material over purchasing from a domestic producer. And this is really a concern to call them maybe less sophisticated global players in the United States. And risk, you'll be hearing in my presentation, next number of slides, several times. What types of risks that start longer delivery times need to be offset with a surety of time-sensitive delivery. Costs for things like LCs that need to be opened. Prompt and efficient claim resolution. Your domestic mills are doing claim resolutions typically in 3 to 4 weeks. If your mill is longer than that, you're going to be in jeopardy of affecting your reputation as a domestic-esque partner. And the ability to act as the importer of record when trade actions come into play. And these trade actions are coming back to the forefront, as I think my panel colleague is going to mention shortly. And the losses, I think part of the reason is the losses that we saw in that previous slide of the profitability, or say lack of profitability, that the domestic mills have been experiencing. And these are not easy to read, but just to give you an idea, there's 3 slides here which are, as of today, the cases that are either already in place or are in play for steel going into the United States from Turkey. You have your standard pipe, your light-walled tubing, your OCTG, your rebar. It moves on to the welded API line pipe, both AC, AD and CVD, heavy walled rectangular tubing, and that case is still in play with some DOC and ITC. The International Trade Commission has, I think, till May or June to come up with the final numbers there. And hot rolled Flat steel is going to May, June, July. There's going to be some finals coming out of that. And these trade cases, again, I won't get into that because it's coming up shortly. They don't happen overnight. There's a long, very regimented process of how these things are handled. But from a importer standpoint, it's very frustrating, and under certain rules, we choose not to bring in steel if the mill is under a dumping order, because the timing, if it comes in after the specific time, there are potential liabilities that can get very, very expensive. So in short, I think maybe the United States is not always the easiest country in terms of steel imports, but if you do it responsibly, and that is in our mantra, as I mentioned earlier in my opening remarks, it can be a long-term relationship, and it can certainly be very, very profitable. And I think just as quickly, the U.S. certainly is not the only, call it careful or protectionist player in the world, and although perhaps one of the most aggressive. And from this slide, I think each country has its own set of either restrictions, or there's one up here for the United States called import licenses. That's not a restriction, it's just another regulation on top of a number of other regulations to make just one more step you have to go through to import steel. We, certainly as a trading industry, can do it in our sleep, but it has to get done. And I think as John mentioned earlier, there's some very strict timing and rules that you just have to play by. And I think whether it is the U.S. or the rest of the world, China is certainly the one that has a target on its chest. This is these both came from Eurofur, by the way. They're not slides that we got in the States, but this is just a quick recap of the levels by color-coded as to what the average anti-dumping duties are on Chinese steel. And here it mentions the United States average AD penalties out of China is about 142%. And now I'm going to be getting into the value of the steel trader and exporter. And this is my last section where I'm going to try and highlight, again, what the typical steel buyer in the United States expects from an import transaction. This next set of slides are all part of what was originally a trader value presentation that I've done over the years. But I added the word exporter designation because perhaps a mill that wants to go on a direct basis, but these are all things that need to keep in mind if you want to do business with the steel buyers in the United States. This set here is more directed to what a trader does, as I was trying to explain the value of a trader. So use that example. The traders buy steel, certainly they sell steel, they move steel. That being said, I think nobody in the steel transportation world around the globe does a better job than the Turkish mills in terms of a CFR or CIF basis. But the U.S. customer also likes to have it delivered to his door, and there somewhere in there is where at least the trader comes into play, because our customers like one buy, one invoice, whenever possible. Traders even make steel. I'm thinking of people like Salzgitter, Thyssen, and Tata, or processes steel. KOP over the years has heat treated an awful lot of green pipe that we bring in from various countries. We thread and couple pipe, and we upset pipe. And certainly finances the transaction. This is a very important part of the international trade game. As I'll mention several times in this presentation, that is the smooth flow of money that makes the steel world go round. Then begs the question, what can a trader or the exporter do for you? And by you, this is something that the customer is asking. And certainly, control profitability. And this is done by controlling the many, many variables, some we'll look at in a second, that are all part of a global trade. The next, again, comes up risk management. And this being considered by most importers really the number one factor that concerns a global transaction, because moving steel from Istanbul to somewhere in Dallas, Texas is a whole lot more complicated than going from mill in Longview, Texas, down to Houston. Because the United States goes from East Coast to West Coast. It's about 5,000 kilometers. You go from Houston up to Chicago, it's about 2,150 kilometers. So the big question then might be, how can you help me achieve more revenue at the end of my business day, or more appropriately, the customer's big question. I think, or more clearly, how can you as a trader or an exporter do a better job for me than my traditional domestic suppliers? And our solution, obviously, help them maximize their income. And this is with lower or more consistent costs that they can absolutely count on. And it's important to remember that cost is different than price. And minimize risk. Again, an element to be highlighted shortly. But in all cases, your trader, exporter, does become that customer's contract partner. In the case of trading, we talk about being a variable cost. The customers use us when they need us and don't when they don't. I think of one of my biggest wire rod customers. Back in the 90s, he had 7 people in his import department for wire rod for 350,000 tons. Today, he's one gentleman buying 450,000 tons, and all of his imports go through a trader because he has a smaller staff and he likes somebody else to carry on the headaches that are involved in an import transaction, and again, wants it delivered to his door with one invoice. And innovation and flexibility kind of are a combined set of dynamics where, unlike the domestic supplier where you ship the steel, give an invoice, net 30 days payment, the typical buyer on an import basis wants a little more flexibility. He wants extended terms. He wants closed-end consignments, or he wants someone to do a quarterly position buy for him with 30, 60, and 90-day terms. Essentially just anything that will help him justify the longer lead times and the obvious uncertainties that can happen that are associated with those long lead times. 4 weeks, 5 weeks for a domestic transaction delivery. It can be 3 to 4 months or more for an import transaction. So, the trader exporter equals risk management. And here it is again, as I mentioned earlier. The U.S. customer's mindset is that imports are just a little more prone to risk than his domestic partner that is kind of down the street. And what are some of these risks? What do some of these risks look like? And this is just a few. Freight problems. We had a ship last year. We were not the controlling cargo of that. A ship got arrested. It sat in the Greek port for 7 months before the Greek courts could figure out how to get it out of jail, so to speak. Damage. Saltwater rust, broken packages. We all know what can go wrong there. Duty penalties. Nobody wants to get caught in anti-dumping CBD crossfires. And actually, Denise, I gave you a package to share with anybody who wants it. It's a rather extensive PowerPoint that takes out a lot of the mystery of this black box called the U.S. trade laws, and I would share that with anybody who would want it. Market claims, always a concerning factor in a declining market, which we saw several times in the last 10 years. Strikes, we had 400 containers stuck in Los Angeles last year when the longshoremen went on strike. They were sitting inside the port. We had trucks outside waiting to pick them up. There was nobody to load the trucks. We paid demurrage every day on those containers for about 40 days. Late payments, the customers in the United States are very accustomed, as you may have already seen, to open terms. If it's a net 30, chances are you're going to get net 40, 45. It's a net 60. It's just the way that system works, and you put that into your equation. Demurrage, we all know about demurrage, dumping, a growing dynamic, as we just said, and they even came up with the 201s. The last one we saw on that, it's a restriction put on by the president. Last one we saw was under George W. Bush, 2000, 2001. We as the AIIS and several other coalitions Went to fight that as best we could in Washington. We used lobbyists. We got that reduced from a 3-year program down to just 18 months. But the bottom line of that one was it cost more jobs in American manufacturing than are employed in the entire steel industry. And they're rattling that saber now, and we don't know what President Obama might do or not do, being in a lame duck position, but I can assure you our office in Washington is watching that very, very closely. So at the end of the business day, though, the message that we want our customers to hear, our customers, your customers, is that experience equals success. And I've been in the business 43 years, and I learned a long time ago to never say I've seen it all. Once you say that, something the next day is going to come up and bite you. What type of experience are we talking about? I'll go through these fairly quickly. But we want our customers to understand experience pays. The trader or you would serve as their quality assurance annex, doing the mill audits, doing the mill inspections, even being there when the first rollings are going on. Purchasing services. As I said, my customer who bought wire rod wants somebody to do basically the legwork for him, and he'll give you the PO as long as it meets that ASTM spec and is a respected mill that has been audited by at least somebody in your company. Language services was mentioned earlier too. Typically, anywhere in the world, the buyer there wants to be able to communicate in terms that he's comfortable with. And I like to tell a small joke about what do you call a person that speaks several languages? And the answer is multilingual. What do you call a person that speaks 2 languages? He's bilingual. And then what do you call a person that speaks 1 language? An American. But and I take deference to my colleagues from Houston who are multilingual. So, but I think you get my point on that. Treasury and accounting functions, the customer wants somebody to make sure that the bills of lading, the packing lists, the invoices have been cross-checked, that every kilo that goes on the ship in the port of loading gets to his front door in proper order and in the right quantities. They don't have the staff or the time or the desire to do that. A banking partner, certainly as a trading company or as a steel mill, you're not a bank, but we are things from a trading side, we're different than a bank. We like to tell them that we do finance their business through using our own banks, but we are intimately involved in that transaction, and most of the time we pretty much understand their business and that particular transaction more than their banker, with all respect for our BBVA people here today. To serve as an economic department annex, going back to the 1990s, before the internet, the customers looked toward their trader or toward their foreign mill producer to know what's going on in the world, what's happening with raw materials, what's happening with iron ore, what's happening with billets coming from Russia going to Eastern Europe. They just weren't that savvy with information, and they looked as that to be part of the relationship. Since the internet, everybody seems to know everybody's business about the same time, but even that said, the headlines that are on the internet are coming from you as the mills or as your suppliers. So they still look at that as pre-information, but I think more importantly, analyzing that information to help them understand forecasts and where to go 3 and 6 months down the road, because that is the import environment. Traffic department, as I said, really nobody does that ocean business better than Turkey, but the customer wants it to his door in most cases. A branch sales office, there have been cases where we sell a customer steel, he makes a part, we end up helping him sell those parts somewhere else in the world. Public relations and cultural relations, spoken several times earlier. Everybody has their own little comfort zone and wants to understand better how the style of negotiation is done. And lastly, customs and documentations annex, very, very critical, because U.S. trade laws are strict as anywhere in the world. And I think be it an issue of careful of fumigated dunnage, country of origin markings, or the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, or the Agricultural Administration gets on board. We had a case where they found rice hulls from a Turkish wire rod producer deem them to be harmful or potentially harmful to the U.S. Farmland, we had to ship 10,000 tons of wire rod back out of the country. That was about 10 years ago. Haven't done it since. So I think in closing, what does a tier one trader or tier one exporter get for them? And I call it the four-legged table of a profitable, consistent, and risk-minimized trade. You've got to have clear communication to avoid mistakes. Financial strength, because as I said, the smooth transition of money, generally before that steel leaves the producer's port, is what makes the steel world go around. Strong relationships, to build those partnerships that can eclipse such problems as market claims. And last, trust, which is built over time, but kind of is part of all of the three legs standing above it. So with that, I thank you for your time today and look forward to your questions.